You can't be serious, Dad. My voice trembled as I stared him down across the glossy expanse of his oversized mahogany desk. He leaned back into his leather chair, exhaling slowly, the very picture of composure. With a calm flick of his wrist, he rested his cigar in the ashtray, as if the conversation had already concluded. "This isn't open for debate, Catherine," he said, his tone final. My hands balled into fists at my sides. I wasn't ready to give up. "That's it?" I snapped. "You're willing to hand over everything to Grant, someone who couldn't care less about the firm, just because I'm not your son?" He didn't so much as blink. "This firm is meant for your brother to lead," he replied, each word laced with certainty. "You've done well academically, and I'm sure you'll make a fine wife one day. But this isn't your role. My name is Catherine Mercer. I'm 26, a Harvard Law graduate, and the daughter of Henry Mercer, the founder of Mercer and Associates, one of the most influential law firms in Dallas. My entire life has revolved around proving myself, top of my class, undefeated on the debate team, graduating with honors. I didn't want to inherit success. I wanted to earn it." But standing there in his office, surrounded by leather, smoke, and the stifling weight of tradition, I realized none of it mattered. I wasn't the heir. I was just the daughter. I steadied my breath and met his gaze. "Grant doesn't even want this job. He's careless, Dad. You know, he barely made it through community college, and he has zero clue how to lead a firm." He sighed, rubbing his temples as if I was the irrational one. "He'll learn. He's my son, this firm is his by right. You," he added, softening ever so slightly, "you have choices. A future that doesn't demand the burden of leadership. I'm doing this for your own good." A bitter laugh escaped me. "You're not protecting me. You're patronizing me. I've outworked everyone, especially Grant, and you know it. But because I'm your daughter, I don't even get the chance to prove it." His face hardened like stone. "That's enough, Catherine. We're done here." I turned on my heel, leaving his office with the click of my heels echoing through the halls of the family estate. As I passed through the grand foyer, I spotted my mother in the parlor, gently arranging flowers. She looked up, her face soft but weary. "Catherine," she asked gently. "What happened?" I stopped, turning toward her with a mix of heartbreak and rage. "He won't let me join the firm," I said, voice trembling. "He's giving everything to Grant and expects me to just smile and nod like it's fine." She exhaled, setting the flowers down with care. "Your father, he has his beliefs," she said carefully. "Sometimes it's better not to challenge him, darling. He thinks he's doing what's best." I stared at her, stunned. "You think this is him meaning well?" I asked. "He's dismissing everything I've worked for, because I'm a woman." "And you're standing there trying to excuse it?" She lowered her eyes, and in that moment, I saw the quiet resignation of a woman who had spent her life choosing silence. "I just don't want to see you get hurt, Catherine," she murmured. "Sometimes, it's less painful to leave things the way they are." Her words lingered between us, heavy and unspoken. And in that moment, I knew, I was truly alone. That night, I lay in bed staring blankly at the ceiling, my father's words echoing relentlessly in my mind. I thought about all I had endured to reach this point, the sleepless nights studying law, the grueling hours spent in debate halls at Harvard, the sacrifices I made to uphold the Mercer name. And for what? To be told I was a placeholder until I could marry into another influential family. The thought made me sick to my stomach. By morning, I was already halfway through packing when my bedroom door creaked open. My mother stood there, her face pale with confusion. "Catherine, what's going on?" she asked, concern flooding her voice. Before I could answer, my father appeared behind her, his expression a mix of irritation and disbelief. "What is all this?" he barked as he stepped into the room. "Where do you think you're going?" Grant arrived last, leaning in the doorway in his robe, smirking. "Taking a little getaway, sis?" I closed the suitcase with a firm click and turned to face them. "I'm leaving," I said calmly. Since I'm not wanted at the firm and don't fit into your carefully crafted plans, I'm going to find a place where I do. My father's face darkened, and my mother clutched at her pearls, tears brimming in her eyes. Catherine, she whispered, please don't do this. Let's talk. But I stood firm. There's nothing to discuss. You've made it very clear where I stand in this family. My father stepped closer, his tone colder than ever. Don't be absurd, Catherine. This is your home. Where would you even go? And what for? To prove some kind of point? I stared him down. Yes, Dad. To prove that I matter. That I've earned everything I've accomplished and don't need to wait for your permission to be taken seriously. If I can't grow here, I'll go somewhere that sees my worth. Grant chuckled, folding his arms. You're really overreacting. Throwing a fit just because Dad won't give you the reins yet? His smugness lit a fire in me. This isn't a fit, Grant, I snapped. It's called having self-respect. You wouldn't understand, you've never had to fight for anything. Enough, my father growled, raising a hand to stop us. Catherine, you're not going anywhere. You belong here, with us. I reached for my suitcase, my voice unwavering. No, Dad. I belong where I'm valued. And that's not here. I walked past them without pause, the wheels of my suitcase clicking softly against the polished floors as I descended the sweeping staircase. My mother followed behind me, her voice fragile. Catherine, please, she whispered, don't leave like this. We can work it out, as a family. I paused at the bottom step, turning to look at her, the woman who had spent her life silencing herself to avoid conflict. Mom, I said gently, I love you, but I can't keep lying to myself. Nothing's going to change if I stay. It never does. My father stood silently at the top of the stairs, his expression unreadable, giving away nothing. Grant leaned casually on the banister, unmoved, as if watching me walk out was just another part of his morning. I opened the front door and glanced back one last time. When you're ready to see me as more than a daughter meant to marry well, you'll know where to find me. My voice was steady, composed. And then I stepped outside, the brisk morning wind greeting me as I closed the door behind me. For the first time, I could breathe. I never looked back. Within days, I lined up an interview with one of the top law firms in Dallas. They didn't care about my last name, they were interested in my resume, my work ethic, and the fire in my eyes. When I stepped into their office, I wasn't Henry Mercer's daughter. I was Catherine Mercer, Harvard Law graduate and aspiring attorney. By the end of the week, they offered me a spot. For the first time in my life, I was welcomed for what I could do, not for the family I came from. The job was demanding, but the rewards were immediate. I thrived in an environment where my success wasn't dependent on pedigree. My new boss, Richard Hayes, a savvy, forward-thinking leader, recognized my potential early. He encouraged me, challenged me, and gave me real opportunities. Within months, I was managing major cases and earning the trust of people who mattered. This wasn't the life I'd envisioned growing up, but it was mine, and that made it better. But even as my career soared, the nights were the hardest. Severing ties with my family hadn't been simple, no matter how necessary it felt. In the quiet moments, like returning to a dark apartment after a marathon day, I would feel the ache of it. I missed my mother's quiet warmth, even if she rarely defended me. I missed Grant's chaotic energy, as grating as it was. What stung the most, though, was how easily my father let me go. The months rolled by. I lost myself in the work, pushing through late nights and high-stakes negotiations. The stress didn't slow me down, it drove me. Each case won was another reminder that I had value on my own. I wasn't just holding my ground, I was carving out a place for myself. Richard noticed. He started handing me the most complex clients, and soon, my name was being whispered in the halls, someone to watch. The transformation wasn't just happening in the office. I was changing inside too. I stopped asking myself what my father would think, or whether I'd disappointed the image they wanted to preserve. Every success became a declaration, I'm more than the Mercer name. One afternoon, Richard called me into his office. His space was expansive, yet minimalist, practical, like him. He gestured for me to sit, his sharp blue eyes watching me closely. "Catherine," Richard began, his voice calm and deliberate, "there's a case I believe you're ready to take on. It's complex, high profile, and will put you front and center." I leaned in slightly, curiosity piqued. "What kind of case?" He hesitated, then continued, choosing his words carefully. "We're representing a client who's filing a lawsuit against Mercer and Associates. It's a major negligence claim over a contract dispute. High stakes, big press, your father's firm is under fire." The room suddenly felt colder. I sat frozen, the weight of those words settling in my chest. "You're asking me to take a case against my own father's firm?" I said at last, keeping my voice even despite the storm inside. Richard gave a single nod. "I know it's complicated. But that's also why I want you on this. You know their playbook. You know how they operate. And frankly, you're one of the most capable attorneys on our team. If anyone can take this on and win, it's you." I inhaled deeply, my thoughts racing. "You realize what this could do, to me, to my family," I said slowly. "This isn't just another case." "I get it," Richard replied, his expression serious. "But this is your opportunity to show the world what you're made of. To prove you're not just a legacy, you're the real deal. Think of it as your moment to break free from their shadow." I leaned back in my chair, his words sinking in. "It's a lot to process," I admitted quietly. He nodded with empathy. "I'm not expecting an answer right now. I understand this is personal. But we'll need a decision soon. If you're in, we move forward immediately." "Can I have until tomorrow?" I asked. "I just need time to think it through. It's not only about my career. It's everything." "Of course," he said. "Just let me know by end of day tomorrow." "I hope you say yes." That night, sleep was a stranger. I lay awake, staring into the darkness, thinking about everything I stood to gain, or lose. Accepting the case would mean standing directly in opposition to my father, the man who refused to see me as his equal. It would mean challenging everything the Mercer name represented. But it would also be my shot at independence, at finally proving, to everyone and to myself, that I didn't need their approval to be great. I spent the next 2 days wrestling with the choice. I thought about how quickly my father had dismissed me, how my mother had said nothing in my defense, and how Grant had walked into my future like it was owed to him. I thought about the resentment, the silence, and the injustice. And then, I thought about what it would mean to fight back, and win. By the third morning, my decision was made. I walked into Richard's office, my back straight and my voice unwavering. "I'm in," I said. His eyes lit up. "That's what I wanted to hear," he said, a grin forming on his face. "Let's go make history." The morning of my first litigation hearing arrived, and the weight in the air was unmistakable as I stepped into the courtroom. My grip tightened around my briefcase, and the sharp click of my heels echoed against the smooth floor with every determined step. My client walked confidently beside me, trusting in my capabilities, but all I could focus on was the confrontation I knew lay ahead. As we neared the front, I spotted them, my father and Grant seated at the opposing counsel's table. Their faces turned toward me, and as soon as our eyes locked, I could feel the jolt of recognition hit them both like a wave. My father's jaw clenched, his gaze sharpening as it registered who I was. Grant's mouth fell open slightly before he caught himself, replacing the shock with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. I saw the flicker of discomfort there. I placed my briefcase on the desk and held their stares without flinching. I wouldn't look away. This was my moment, and neither their presence nor their reactions would shake me. For the briefest second, my father's expression seemed to soften, but he quickly leaned toward Grant to whisper something. I didn't care what. I was focused. Once the hearing began, I stepped into my role without hesitation. Every submission, every objection, every reference I made was precise. My voice stayed steady, my posture composed, my attention rooted in the facts of the case. When the judge addressed me, I responded firmly and clearly, not once allowing my father's silent watch or Grant's sneering glances to distract me. I wasn't their daughter or sister in that courtroom, I was Catherine Mercer, lead counsel for the plaintiff, and I was here to win. Even as Grant stumbled through his statements, fumbling over his words and losing track of his arguments, I kept my face neutral. I treated him like any other opposition, professional, assertive, and completely uncompromising. Every time he made an error or twisted the facts, I calmly corrected the record, citing exact case law and presenting solid documentation. My father barely reacted, his face unreadable, though I could feel his gaze never left me. It didn't matter. I wasn't seeking his respect, I already had my own. By the time the third hearing ended, it was evident to everyone, especially my father and Grant, that the case was slipping from their grasp. Grant's inexperience had left them vulnerable, and my preparation made their arguments collapse one after another. My father attempted to salvage the damage by stepping in occasionally, but even he couldn't undo the harm Grant had done. By the fourth appearance, they offered a settlement. The opposing counsel approached with terms that clearly indicated how unbalanced things had become. After some negotiation, we agreed to an outcome that heavily favored my client. As the agreement was finalized and signatures were exchanged, I caught my father watching me from across the courtroom. His expression had shifted, less stern, more weary. Maybe even remorseful. Grant, in contrast, refused to meet my eyes, focusing on the table like a child reprimanded in class. I didn't utter a single word to either of them. There was nothing left to say. I had accomplished exactly what I intended, and that was enough. Normally, after a session ended, I would stay behind to wrap up with my client and exchange polite nods or brief conversations with opposing counsel, a small act of professionalism I believed in, even in the tensest cases. But today, that ritual never came. My father and Grant had already gathered their things and exited without so much as a glance in my direction. No handshake. No acknowledgement. Not even a curt nod of respect. I would be lying if I said it didn't sting. Despite everything, a sliver of me had still hoped for some small sign that they had seen my worth, that they understood what I had just done. But they didn't. They walked away, heads down, beaten not just by the case, but by their pride. And I was left standing there, with the air thick with everything they hadn't said, the silence pressing against my chest like a final verdict. I exhaled slowly, pushing the feeling aside. I still had work to do, and my client needed me. I had delivered the win, and that was what mattered. Later that evening, when I walked into the firm, I was greeted by a round of applause from my colleagues. The moment I stepped through the glass doors, the energy shifted. Richard was the first to meet me, his grin wide, a champagne flute in hand. He clapped me firmly on the shoulder. "Outstanding, Catherine," he said, raising his glass. "That was a textbook performance. You brought home a huge win, not just for the client, but for the firm." Someone had arranged a small celebration in the break room. Drinks, hors d'oeuvres, cheerful chatter. Even my client showed up briefly to personally thank me, their handshake strong and sincere. "You were amazing, Catherine," they said. "We wouldn't have stood a chance without you." And for the first time all day, I allowed myself to smile. Not for my father. Not for Grant. But for me. In that moment, surrounded by people who saw me clearly, not as an extension of someone else's legacy, but as a professional in my own right, I felt seen. Validated. This victory was mine, and no one could take that from me. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat by the window with a glass of wine. The city lights blinked in the distance, a quiet hum of life that matched the quiet in my chest. The adrenaline had faded, and in its place came reflection. My thoughts wandered back to the courtroom. To the way my father's face had hardened with every point I argued. To how Grant couldn't bring himself to look at me once the verdict was read. I had imagined them livid. Defensive. But instead, they gave me silence. And that silence cut deeper than any outburst ever could. All these years, I'd chased the idea of earning my father's approval, of proving that I belonged, not just in the family, but in the firm. And even after standing across from them and winning, I still didn't know if I had finally been seen. Did they recognize my worth? Or had I simply become the face of everything they had failed to protect? The question hung unanswered as I watched the Dallas skyline shimmer into the night. The next morning, I stepped into the office to the familiar symphony of phones ringing and coworkers chatting over coffee. I had barely made it to my desk when Richard approached, his expression unreadable, though his tone was gentle. "Catherine," he said, stopping beside me, "your father's here. He's in your office." I blinked. "My father?" I repeated, trying to steady my voice as my stomach knotted. Richard nodded. "He arrived about 20 minutes ago. Said he wanted to talk. Take as much time as you need, I'll hold your calls." I thanked Richard, but my thoughts were already spinning as I made my way down the hallway. When I reached my office and pushed the door open, I stopped short. Sitting calmly in one of the chairs across from my desk was Henry Mercer, my father. His hands were clasped tightly, and he looked up as I stepped inside, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, maybe even remorse. "Catherine," he said softly. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I closed the door behind me slowly, unsure of what this was. "Dad," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "What are you doing here?" He stood, adjusting the lapels of his jacket like he needed a second to find his footing. "I came to talk," he said, measured and careful. "To finally say what I should have said a long time ago." I set my bag down on the desk and crossed my arms. "Go ahead. I'm listening." He turned to glance out the window for a moment, then back at me. "What you did in that courtroom," he started, his voice softening. "It was extraordinary. I've seen countless attorneys in my lifetime, but what you did, your preparation, your command of the facts, your poise, it was exceptional. You didn't just hold your own. You dominated." His words took me by surprise, but I didn't let it show. I waited, silent. "I spent so many years convinced that tradition was the only way forward," he continued. "That legacy meant passing the business down from father to son. I pushed Grant into a role he wasn't ready for, because I believed it had to be that way." He ran a hand through his graying hair, his expression clouded with regret. "But I was wrong. Completely wrong. You've worked harder than anyone. You've earned every accolade, every victory. And I failed to see that. I failed you." Hearing him admit it out loud made my chest tighten. This was the man who had shut doors in my face and told me I didn't belong at the very table I fought so hard to reach, and now he was standing here, owning it. "Why now?" I asked quietly, my voice firm but calm. "Why say all this now, after everything?" He met my eyes. For once, there was no pride, no coldness, just honesty. "Because I watched you do what I thought was impossible. And it made me realize just how blind I've been. Grant doesn't want this, not really. But you've shown that not only can you lead, you should be leading." He took a step forward, his voice more earnest now. "Catherine, I want you to come back. Run the firm. The team needs you. I need you." His words filled the room, thick with everything I'd longed to hear, but they didn't land the way I thought they would. I'd spent years hoping for this moment, for this recognition, but now that it was here, I wasn't sure it was enough. "What about Grant?" I asked, searching his face. "What happens to him?" My father exhaled deeply, a shadow passing over his face. "He'll remain at the firm," he said carefully. "But in a role that suits him better. This isn't about him anymore. It's about giving you the place you've always earned." I exhaled slowly, letting his words settle in the silence between us. "I need some time to think this through," I said at last, my voice steady but clear. "There's been so much to process, and I can't make this decision right now. I need a few days to figure out what's right for me." My father gave a solemn nod, his face reflecting a rare mix of seriousness and empathy. Of course, he replied. I didn't expect an answer today. I just needed to be honest with you. He made his way toward the door, but paused before leaving. Turning back, his tone softened. Catherine, he said gently, I may not have said this before, or at least not often enough, but I'm proud of you. Watching you in court, you were remarkable. Better than I ever was. Better than I ever imagined. His words struck me deeper than I expected. I looked at him, momentarily speechless. He gave me a faint, almost uncertain smile, then turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the quiet. I stayed at my desk, his voice echoing in my thoughts, better than I ever was. I had spent so many years fighting for his approval, desperate to prove I was more than just a name on his family tree. And now, after everything, those words held more weight than I could express. But this wasn't just about him anymore. I had proven to myself, and to everyone else, that I was capable. That I belonged. Now, lying in bed long past midnight, I stare up at the ceiling, still trying to make sense of it all. His offer is everything I once dreamed of. A return to the firm, to the legacy I thought would be my future. But to go back would mean walking into the same halls where I was overlooked, where I had to fight to be taken seriously. It would mean sharing space with Grant, knowing how little respect he's ever shown me or the work I've done. On the other hand, there's the firm I'm with now, a place that gave me space to grow, to find my voice, to succeed without anyone holding me back. It's not Mercer and Associates, but it became a part of me. Still, it was never supposed to be the end goal. If I return, I could shape the legacy I always wanted on my own terms. I could redefine what it means to carry the Mercer name. But I'm torn. The decision feels impossible, and it's keeping me up tonight. That's why I'm reaching out to you. If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Would you go back and reclaim what once was yours, or would you move forward and build something new entirely? Let me know in the comments, I really want to hear what you think. And hey, if this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps support the channel and ensures you won't miss more stories like this. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.